Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about the moral theory known as utilitarianism. And to get us started, I want to look at two thought experiments. One is called Spur, the other is called the Fat Man, which are different versions of so-called trolley experiments. So in this first case, the idea is that we're standing on a railway line, and there are 5 people who are going to be run over by this trolley that's barreling down the track. And we're innocent bystanders, but we happen to notice that there is a side track and there's one person on this side track. And we determine that it's possible to save the 5 people by throwing a switch. And if we throw the switch, we will divert the trolley and it will run over the one person who wouldn't have been run over before, and will save the 5 people. So the question here is it better to save 5 lives or to save 1? Knowing that in either case, right, a certain number of people are going to die no matter what you do. Now, in the second experiment, the Fat Man, we have something similar, except this time you're on a footbridge that overlooks a trolley track. And same kind of problem here. We have 5 people attached to the track and they're going to be run over and killed by the trolley. But you notice that there's a rather obese man who is overlooking the trolley track. Now, it's not explained why he's there, so we just simply go with the experiment. And I think the person is large here simply because it is thought, be large enough to stop the trolley. So the question is, would you then push the person over the embankment so that he catapults, so to speak, onto the track, stops the trolley, dies in the process, but also saves the 5 people? Now, it's interesting because in many cases, done cross-culturally, not just in the United States, but in other countries, we'll see that a fairly large percentage of people will say that they would throw the switch. But they, in many cases, will say it would be completely wrong to push the person onto the track. And yet, if you think about it, this may be, and I say may, because this is open to a certain degree of debate, this may be inconsistent, because isn't it the case that in each instance we're really thinking about saving the same number of lives? The ratio is 1 life to 5. And all things being equal, saving 5 lives is better than saving 1 life. Well, if you have some sympathy with that view, you may be a utilitarian, because utilitarians believe that the ends justify the means. They are consequentialists. They're not really concerned so much with what we do. They're more concerned with how what we do produces certain consequences which are good for society as a whole. Now, they're typically hedonistic, which is a fancy way of saying that they typically will be people who will say that when we talk about goodness, we mean pleasure. When we talk about badness, we mean pain or absence of pleasure. However, just in passing, it's worth noting there are some versions of utilitarianism which focus not so much on pleasure or happiness, but focus on welfare or benefit or some kind of preference. So as an example, we might focus on making a society incredibly safe or incredibly free, rather than necessarily happy. And on this slide we have 3 of the main movers and shakers in utilitarianism, including Peter Singer, who is a contemporary Australian philosopher who has been at Princeton University for many years. Now, there are 2 main types of utilitarianism. We have act and rule utilitarianism. So I'd like you to think about these as 2 different ways of getting towards some great end that benefits society as a whole. So what the act utilitarian does is he or she focuses on each individual action that we decide to perform at a given moment. And the act utilitarian will say we should always choose the one action that will produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people at a given time. This seems to be the view that Jeremy Bentham favored, and it's not entirely clear, but in many cases it seems that Mill, his successor, opposed this view and was more in favor of a rule utilitarian perspective. So imagine this scenario. We have an individual named Bill, and Bill is about to take an exam, and he knows he can't pass it. And the exam is in, say, philosophy, and this is a subject that Bill has no interest in, and he doesn't really think he needs to understand it in order to achieve his goal of becoming a medical researcher. So if he attains this goal, that is, becoming a medical researcher, he'll save many lives. Now, suppose Bill sees a clear opportunity to cheat on the exam and pass the class without being caught. Should he do so? Well, keep in mind, if he were not to cheat, the long-term consequences here may actually be not all that optimal. I mean, if he gets an F, maybe he doesn't get into medical school. If he doesn't get into medical school, maybe he never becomes a medical researcher and never saves lives. So if he could cheat, and he can get away with it, then you might say, okay, all things being equal, if cheating will produce better consequences than honest test-taking would, then it would be better, in this case, for Bill to cheat. And that seems to be what a general act utilitarian would do. Now, think of another instance. Your friend Phil asks to hide in your attic because he's afraid that Zeke, who's an axe-wielding maniac, is coming to murder him. You agree to hide Phil, but then Zeke shows up at your front door and asks if Phil is hiding in your attic. Do you decide to lie to Zeke in order to save Phil's life? Now again, an act utilitarian would say, well, yes, obviously. I mean, a lie is not really technically wrong. What would be wrong would be allowing something bad to happen to your friend. So if you have to lie in order to protect your friend's life, then by all means lie. Lying is sometimes the right thing to do. Not lying would actually likely produce worse consequences than lying would in this case. Now, a contrasting view would be rule utilitarianism, and as the label might suggest, rule utilitarians don't look at individual actions, but they subsume each action, each decision we make under a given rule or framework. So a rule utilitarian will have a list of general rules that he or she would like to follow, like don't steal, be charitable, save innocent life, don't cheat, be kind, what have you. Now, why is the rule a good rule? Well, because in the long run, in the estimation of the rule utilitarian, following that rule will produce better consequences than not following that rule would. And it seems to be the view that Mill endorsed. So again, if we go back to Bill, in this particular case, yes, Bill might be able to get away with cheating, and he might actually not become a medical researcher if he didn't cheat. But because cheating itself is a sacrosanct rule that we shouldn't break. Because if we had a society where everybody cheated all or most of the time, we would have really, really bad consequences. Grades wouldn't have any meaning, transcripts wouldn't have any meaning. You go in for an operation and you think, wow, I hope my surgeon didn't cheat on his medical boards or her medical boards. It gets pretty scary pretty quickly the more you think about it. So a rule utilitarian is going to say, no, you shouldn't cheat. Yeah, Bill, you might be able to get away with it, but this is just not a good thing to do. Because cheating in general will produce worse consequences than honest test-taking will. Now, note that this doesn't mean Bill can't get away with cheating in this case. It just means that he shouldn't cheat regardless of that fact in this particular instance. Now we think of Phil again. Again, same kind of problem, right? Should we actually lie to save Phil's life? Well, a rule utilitarian could say, hey, look, we have to have some rules here, so obviously if we have to choose between a rule that says lying or not lying, we should have a rule that says, look, don't lie. So since lying in general will produce worse consequences than not lying will, we should not lie. Now, it is possible, of course, in this case, to sort of fudge this to some extent, because we have another choice. Between lying and not lying, you could also be silent, although that probably won't help you that much. If Zeke is really an axe-wielding maniac, Zeke might be extremely violent to you, he might threaten you. At some point, you might really have to say something. Now, in sum then, the act utilitarian looks at each choice that leads to a particular action, whether it's lying, whether it's cheating, whether it's walking a person across the street as an act of kindness, whether it's donating to a charity on a particular day. And they look at that particular action and they say, okay, well, what are the good consequences of that one action? And what are the projected bad consequences? And if the good consequences outweigh the bad consequences, then clearly that action is preferable to other actions which will not produce such good consequences. At any given time, we should find the one action that we think will, if we choose it, will produce the best consequences we can possibly produce. So, to take a contemporary example that's bandied about quite a bit, we could think of torture. So it's no good, says the act utilitarian, to say that we should follow a rule that says don't torture people. If we really think that torture will produce the best intelligence and protect the most innocent lives, then in that one case where we think torture is the only way to produce those consequences, then the act utilitarian could provide a justification for torture. Now, the rule utilitarian, by contrast, subsumes each of our choices under a kind of rule. So the question would be not what act am I performing in these circumstances, but what kind of action am I thinking about performing? Am I thinking about lying? In which case, do I have a rule about whether lying, for the most part, will produce good or bad consequences? Am I thinking about cheating? Am I thinking about being kind? To take the case of torture again, we have a rule that says we should not torture people. There's a legal framework in place. In fact, we have lots of rules, like rules of due process, rules about the collection of evidence, rules about unreasonable search and seizure, and these kinds of things. All of these rules are, of course, in place, not because in every single case they protect people who are always innocent, because of course there are many guilty people that these rules protect, but because we've decided that having these rules, for the most part, will produce better consequences for society. So in sum, the act utilitarian will deny that following rules is really important, unless those rules will maximize utility. The rule utilitarian counters that, look, it's okay to risk losing a certain amount of happiness in the short term for a greater amount of long-term happiness that will result from following a rule. So yes, I could torture the person. Yes, I could cheat on the exam, but I won't do so because that would violate a particular rule. Now, in a subsequent video, I want to talk about various criticisms of each of these types of utilitarianism.